In this video, we want to discuss how to create fields, properties, and methods within your classes. Now, if you watched the previous video, you know that we talked quite a bit about properties and methods and even walked through how to use those properties and methods of a created instance of a class. And maybe we covered a little bit too much ground in that video, and some of it should have been reserved for this video. So what we'll do here is just fill in some of the cracks and some of the things that maybe we didn't talk about previously. The first distinction that I want to make is the difference between fields and properties. When we talked about this public name as string and this private m_id as integer, we called these properties, and that's not exactly right. In Visual Basic.net, they actually have a name called fields. So this is a public field name as string. However, we can still refer to it as a property. A field, though, is different technically than an actual property as defined in this structure, where you have a get structure and a set structure enveloped between the public property and the end property statement. Now, there's a reason why you'd want to use one versus the other. You should use the field approach like this whenever it's not important that you restrict access to the value based on the user's credentials, that you don't have to limit the values. For example, if the name can only be so many characters long and you need to do a check for that, or that you need to check the input for any other reason. Maybe it's to see within it's in a certain bound, whether it's between the certain values or whether it is equal to one of 10 different values that you're checking for, whatever the case might be. If those things are important to you, then what you need to do is to actually use this structure. And you'll see what I've done here was actually to give you an example of this, where in the get, what we've done is check to see if the name property, or rather the name field, is equal to nothing, then we should set the ID to a different value. Otherwise, just take whatever value was in m_id and return that to the caller. So here we did some extra processing, whereas if somebody had just called the name property, we just give them whatever's in the name field. We don't do any additional processing. We don't do any determination or any bounds checking or anything like that. And the same thing is true with the set statement within the property. Notice here that when the value is passed in, we check to see the value and make sure that it's not greater than 500. If it is, then we set the ID back to 1. Otherwise, whatever the value was that was passed in, we set it equal to the private field m_id. So again, there's a very important time to use this functionality, and that's whenever you have to do any bounds checking or limit the values or restrict the access to the actual property itself. If you don't, you probably should save the overhead and just use the field. The next small distinction that I'd like to make is when we looked at the private field, that we also call the private property, m_id, we made this private, so in other words, if you created an instance of the product class, the consumer of the class would not be able to see this property. Instead, it's exposed through a public ID where we actually take the value and then send it back. But be that as it may, notice the naming convention that was used for this variable, m_id. Now, the m_ is something that developers use as a convention to explain that this is a private member of the class, and therefore the m_. So as you see this in code that you'll examine that other people build, the m_ is just a tip-off to you to know that, oh, this is a private field within the class. It's just a naming convention that's sometimes used. The next thing that we want you to notice is that your methods can be either functions, or we can also use subs. So for example, I want to add an additional method that will refresh the values. I can have public sub refresh values. It won't return anything to the client, but what it will do is set the m_id to 0 and the name equal to nothing. So you could call this method, this public method called refresh values. It returns no values, but it does perform an operation on the values within the class. Here we have a method that is a public function. In other words, the function will return a value as an integer, as we see from this statement. So either types are still considered methods within VB.NET vernacular. The other thing that we didn't fully explain is when we actually create an instance of the product within our submain, where we actually execute the application, one of the benefits of creating classes is that you're able to actually see some help. So as I'm typing along and I want to set the name property, all I hit is the period, and all of a sudden we can see all of the methods and properties for the product class that are available. Now the first thing that I want you to notice is that the m_id is not available because it is not set to be a public field or a public property. Rather, I can access the ID field where the m_id actually provides the value to the ID field through this interface. First thing we'll do is set the name property equal to Dan. Then we'll set the ID equal to 3, and then we'll do system console dot write line, and we'll retrieve the value ID. So this will actually call get instead of the set. Then we did something like this: calc as integer equals to p product dot calculate. We call the calculate method, and then we concluded by doing console write line write line, and then calc toString. Okay, so you'll notice as I was typing along, especially whenever we set a property or retrieved a property, so here we did another set of the property, and here we actually retrieved it, that there is help that's provided through IntelliSense as we type the object name that we created, and it'll show us any available public properties or methods that we can use. The other thing that I want to make note of is that we can actually pass our objects as references to other methods of other classes or functions or whatever we have. So what I've done was I created a second class within the same module called Sale. And the Sale has one method called MakeSale. Now I want you to notice here as I scroll over to the right-hand side that you can pass in a product object to this MakeSale function, and then we can refer to the product's properties and methods as we do here. We're checking to see if the value is 3. If it is, then the sale went through. If it's not, then we'll return a false. And so the way that we do this is we've already created an instance of our sale object. So what I'll do is go psale dot MakeSale the product, and we'll just do a dim b result as boolean equal to that. And then we can print off the results or whatever we wish to do. But this is how we send an object reference to an actual method, and then that method can retrieve the values and evaluate it and see if it equals 3 or whatever the case might be. It has access to all the properties and all the methods of that object. So that concludes our discussion about fields and properties and methods and some of the finer points about these things that we'll use time after time as we create classes in VisualBasic.net. So I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned a lot about fields, properties, and methods. Have a great day.